I'd like to welcome you to the Volodymyr Dylynski lecture. This is the 15th such lecture, although we've been running it for 16 years. That's always the COVID skip we've had. But this is a very special one. It is 50 years ago that Mr. Volodymyr Dylynski passed away, and the lecture is in his memory. It comes from a fund that is dedicated to Volodymyr and Lydia Dylynsky, and Miron Dylynsky was with us, of course, is a son from that family. We are very grateful that we are able to hold this, and as we are also grateful that it will be taped, and therefore we'll be able to make it available. You are our select public, but there will be a wider public as well. It is very special in that we have with us today Dr. Andriy Kohut. We've checked, no relation to Zenon Kohut. From much further east, Ternopilshchina. But someone I think who is known to all of you for his extremely important work in two ways. Both in carrying on research on Ukrainian history, his own research as a historian, who began as a historian should in studying the medieval and early modern period, and only then taking on more current events, something we much approve of. But as well, a historian who has been extremely important in making it possible to study contemporary history. And his function has been in two ways. One, he has made available access. That is, there have been tremendous changes that have occurred in Soviets, that what we used to call Soviet studies, the study now of the, thank God, former Soviet Union, in that scholars once went to Moscow and to Leningrad, or then St. Petersburg as it changed. And that is as far as they saw that history. With the closing in particular of to many scholars of the archives, and above all the archives of those institutions connected with the secret police or with organs of security, in Moscow and Leningrad, historians reoriented to a great degree to the Baltic, because they opened up rather quickly there. But then the bonanza became Ukraine, and we are grateful to Dr. Kohut for having done so much to host those historians, to make them see that they could, through the Ukrainian archives, study many general problems, but also in doing so, could learn to focus on Ukraine. We have a major example of such a scholar here in Toronto. That is Dr. Lynne Viola, a longtime professor of the University of Toronto, who I think began very much focused on what she will now admit a Russocentric vision. Through her archival work in Kyiv, she has now created a new Ukrainian historiography for us, studying some of the less pleasant people in Ukrainian history that one finds in these archives, but basing these studies on material in Ukraine. And in that, Dr. Kohut, to a great degree, has played a major role. And his second, I think, great service to us all is that he is preserving that heritage. And at the moment, that's quite a literal statement. That is, we all have been shocked by the destruction of Ukrainian archives, the losses in Chernihiv. We know how valiantly Ukrainian archivists now are working to make sure that materials are digitalized, they are moved from one place to another. Things are going on about which we should not know, better we don't know, in their efforts to preserve that material. And he certainly has been a leader in doing that. He can tell you a little bit more I think in private conversation about when this intensified war started and how he had to return and how much that has meant for preservation of those materials. We are privileged at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies that he works with projects of our institute, and one of these major projects is being conducted by our institute as well as the Folklore Center at the University of Alberta, deals with correspondence that occurred between Ukrainians in Canada and their families in Ukraine, but of course with an intermediary between them. That is, those who watched over all that correspondence, gathered it, and in a way have preserved for us something that might be lost. But of course, we're also part of that horrendous system that prevented so much human contact. And we are very grateful to his work with us on that. He has lectured in many places, in many universities, recently been in the Hoover Institute at Stanford, where I think he's been able to deal with much valuable material, but he's also found material right here in Toronto. We very fortunately have a number of collections like the Potichnyj collection at the Robarts Library that are of importance, and of course we have the Documentation Center here. His lecture this evening will be on Confiscated Voices, the case of Soviet postal censorship related to the Zapad Deportation operations of 1947. Dr. Kohut, please.
Thank you. So it's an honor to me to be here and present my research at the 2022 Volodymyr Dylynský Memorial Lecture. My lecture is based on documents from so-called KGB archives from Ukraine. Thanks to full access on Soviet Secret Services archives, we have opportunity to interpret our recent history in a completely new way. In the condition of the current Russia war against Ukraine, such a rethinking becomes especially important, and often not only as an element of history, but also as an element of security. Contemporary Russia combines the legacy of Russian Empire and Soviet Union. Therefore, for Ukrainian struggles for our independence as an element of security. Contemporary Russia combines the legacy of Russian Empire and Soviet Union. Therefore, for Ukrainian struggles for our independence and democratic path of development, understanding the instruments of both these states or regimes is critically important. The Soviet Union was a state in which repressions, state coercion, and measure of total control were the instruments by which it existed. The Soviet Union inherited many of these repressive tools from its predecessor, from Russian Empire. Deportation and postal censorship are both like that. The study of history of Soviet Union censorship focused more on the cultural aspects of literature, cinema, theater, and music. Proponents of liberal, Marxist, and a new theory of censorship discuss how to interpret censorship as an element of the coercive nature of states, its negative representative influence on artists, or to interpret censorship as an element of creating a certain discourse, thus speaking of some positive effects of censorship. The study of censorship only as a cultural phenomenon significantly limits our understanding of the censorship solely as a kind of act of directed against a small group of people, a kind of creative elite. Communist censorship may thus seem to be a limited or even rather elitist practice. At the same time, the vast majority of society is an observer of recipient of the interaction between the author-censor party ideology and special institutions. However, censorship in Soviet Union was a much more multidimensional phenomenon. One of the practices of censorship which affected almost all residents of Soviet Union was postal censorship. In historiography, very little known about the activities of so-called black cabinets. There are only a few books and articles about so-called perlustration of correspondence. This is how the postal censorship was called in the Soviet Secret Services documents. Practically, from the very beginning of the communist regime, the implementation of postal censorship was assigned to communists of Soviet secret services. Began from Cheka, then GPU and KVD, MGB and KGB and KGB at least. It's like all different reincarnation of Soviet secret services. It's a measure of military censorship or a measure of political control. Deportation or forced resettlements were used by the Bolsheviks to clear the territory of so-called enemies of people, enemy social class, such as the wealthy peasantry, but also as a tool of counter-insurgency. Actually, the deportations, codename Zapad or West in English, was carried out in order to force the local population to stop supporting the Ukrainian insurgents and thus completely destroy the anti-Soviet resistance movement. 75 years since the beginning of the Zapad deportation will pass at the end of this week, at Friday. This deportation operation began at 2 in the morning on October 21, 1947. The Soviet secret services planned to carry out a forced eviction from the territory of Western Ukraine in one day. However, due to difficult weather conditions, the deportation lasted for several days. The last echelons left the Zabolotyev station on October 26 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Today it's Ivano-Frankivska Oblast. As I have already said, the main purpose of the deportation was the complete defeat of the anti-Soviet resistance movement. Deportation of Ukrainian families, those members were in the undergrounds, began as early as March 31, 1944. From that time until 1946, these forced evictions were carried out in the formal of the daily activities of the Soviet secret services. That is, deportation did not take place as one massive eviction, but as local repression when several dozen of families were evicted at the same time. However, for various reasons, forced evictions actually paused by the end of 1946. The situation changed rapidly in the early spring of 1947. Stalin was dissatisfied with the situation in Ukraine, mass hunger, the too slow creation of collective farms in the newly occupied territories, and what's more, the Ukrainian insurgency have no more been eliminated and continue their struggle against the Kremlin. So Lazar Kaganovich was sent to Ukraine to replace Nikita Khrushchev, who did not cope well enough with the task. Kaganovich has already appointed the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine in March 1947. Kaganovich began to demand the rapid collectivization and Sovietization of Western Ukraine. The demand to immediately defeat the Ukrainian liberation movement was particularly harsh. As early as May 14, 1947, a secret directive was issued in Soviet Ukraine to resume deportation. On June 1, 2 weeks later, a special group was created in Kyiv, the main task of which was to coordinate the actions of regional departments of the Ministry of State Security, how it's called the Soviet Secret Services at the time, or according to abbreviation, it's called MGB, Министерство государственной безопасности. It's like predecessor of KGB. The Soviet Secret Services planned to deport 3 categories of families: the families of the killed insurgents, the families of the repressed, and the families of so-called illegals. That is those who, as of 1947, was in underground and fought against the Soviet occupation. Due to the fact that preparations for forced evictions were too slow, on August 22, a special order was issued in Moscow to carry out a mass one-time deportation operation. Most likely, the result of the Vistula operation reminded Moscow of the effectiveness of one-time mass deportation operation of Ukrainians. According to this order, a special representative headed by Deputy Minister of State Security Sergei Gultsov was sent from Moscow to Ukraine with more than 15 generals and colonels and so on, so on, so on. Additionally, MGB employees were sent to Western Ukraine to prepare and carry out the deportation from the entire Soviet Union. Divisions of internal troops stationed on the territory of Western Ukraine and local members of Communist Party were directly involved in the forced evictions. In total, almost 70,000 people were collected to provide mass deportation. As a result, 26,332 families, or 77,791 individuals, were forcibly evicted to Siberia and Kazakhstan. This accounted for more than every 100 residents of 7 western regions of the Soviet Ukraine. Half of all deportees were women over the age of 50. 27% of all evicted were children under the age of 15, and only 24% were men. More than half of all evicted families were families of convicted Ukrainian insurgents. Another quarter were the families of the killed underground fighters, and only 16% of deported families were families whose members were at underground and those moments. Thus, deportation became, in the fact, a repeated repression against those families who had already suffered losses. For a long time, documents about Zapad deportation were unavailable, and it was particularly unknown to the most researchers. The opening of the KGB archives made it possible to study this example of forced eviction from Western Ukraine. However, the study of deportation, based on Soviet Secret Service records, significantly limits our knowledge of what happens. The analysis of the documents proves that the Chekists manipulate the data. So, for example, to exceed the eviction plan, the operation heads set to the regional offices a more significant number of people for deportation than they reported to Kaganovich and Khrushchev. In their reports, the Soviet Secret Services noted that the forced evictions went according to plan. No one managed to escape from the road to exile. Moreover, the Chekists reported that the most of the local population welcomed removing of so-called bandits' families. But was the situation really as it was described in the reports? Knowing the practice of Soviet office management, you can immediately say that it's not. If today, for example, we compare what officially Russia says about its war of occupation against Ukraine with I-Times narratives, it's become evident that the Russia are lying. However, in 1947, there was no one to collect evidence and what happens. Moreover, not a single photo of the Zapad deportation has yet been found. The MGB employees strictly monitored that information about the deportation was not preserved and did not spread. So, how can we hear the voices of eyewitnesses? Find out how they saw the mass deportation of 1947. One such source is memories. Unfortunately, there are a very few memories, and they were recorded already later than 1990s, not immediately after the deportation. Instead, the KGB archives contains documents based on the result of postal censorship, and they allows us to learn more about voices from the ground. On the eve of the deportation in 1946, there were significant changes in postal censorship. January 1, 1946, it was a date of return from wartime measure to measure of political control. The change means that mail now be censored selectively. Not all correspondence, as was the case during the so-called military censorship. However, this change did not apply the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and also Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. In these reoccupied territories, all postal correspondence was subject to censorship. All stop and send letters were written by the local population. In order to completely censor all mail in the territory of Western Ukraine, 26 special points were created in which more than 400 employees were at work. On the slide, you can see the list of the cities where the censorship point were created. The instruction on work of the NKGB political control of January 1946 started that the correspondence per illustrations was subject to strict secrecy, not only in view of the danger of revealing the methods of Chekist work, but also by the very fact that the existence in Soviet Union of secret postal censorship. All letters read and reviewed by the censorship, depending on their content, had to be either passed to the addressees or confiscated, or sent to the relevant Soviet Secret Services units for operational use. Thus, obtained information was to be recorded in the memoranda either as a copy of separate letter or as an extract. Systematic information messages of thematic issue had to be prepared regularly and sent to the relevant Soviet Secret Services or party authorities. The institutions also provide for data for daily, monthly, and quarterly reporting on the result of postal censorship. Monthly reports of the work of so-called postal censorship checkpoints of the Ministry of the State Security of the Soviet Ukraine were prepared in 3 copies. The first was sent to the head of Department V, it's like a call-it department who organizes this work. in the Moscow. The second to the Secretariat of Ministry of State Security in Soviet Ukraine to Kyiv, and third went to the file of Department V. As such, documentation had a short shelf life up to 5 years. The materials of the postal censorship points preserved only in the archives of another units of Soviet secret services. For example, most of the examples what I used in my presentation, they preserved in the collection of Secretariat of the Soviet secret services. Unfortunately, most of all these files, what was collected by the Unit V, was destroyed because they preserved not more than 5 years. From this point of view, our study, it's not so easy to find some or another letters. But if some letters mention very tremendous informations, this information, on this information we are prepared special extract and putting to those units what need to work on this information. One of such huge events was the most massive Soviet deportation from Western Ukraine in October 1947, also be on the focus of the working of the postal censorship. According to the instructions, one of the tasks of political censorship was to, start citation, identify the political sentiments and responses of various segments of the population to domestic and foreign political events. End citation. The analysis of these archival sources has several limitations related to the specific of the work of the postal censorship point. Almost all preserved documents are excerpts or letters translated into Russians. And of course, sometimes it's very hard to say what was really written in the letters, because people who prepared the extractions, they translate to Russians. Moreover, the extracts contain only the content that directly fell under the measure of postal censorship. Instead, it is impossible to establish what the rest of the letter contained, or what information was in the letter that were confiscated and destroyed without extracts. Thus, the researcher who will work with them will deal with at least several levels of information filtering. The first filter is the selection of letter by postal censors. The second filter is a selection of extracts to illustrate a specific task of Soviet secret services, and the third is a translation into Russians. Also, information from letters translate not only from Ukrainian, but from Hebrew, from Greek, German, and so on, so on, so on. If, for example, in some these points of postal censorship, they cannot translate letters from some unknown languages, these letters was copied and sent to Kyiv and to Moscow, try to find the specialists who can translate this letter to Russians. However, despite this limitation, postal censorship provides an opportunity to analyze the voices of ordinary people, how they assessed certain events in private correspondence, what they knew about forthcoming deportation, what they thought about it, and what behavior patterns they declared in response to the communist regime police. The decision to resume forced eviction was made by Soviet regime in mid-May. All preparation activities were to be held in strict secrecy. And of course, in the report, the operation chiefs claimed that the regime of conspiracy was followed during the preparation of the deportation. And no one suspected that the communist regime was preparing a mass operation. However, the postal censorship results clearly indicate the secrecy failure. For example, in a letter dated June 26, a resident of Roketny Rayon of Rivne Oblast, Ulyana Shevchuk, wrote in a letter to Hryhory Shevchuk to the Irkutsk Oblast. Do not, and you can see this citation and how looks these extracts on the slide. Do not forget us. As long as we live, we will not forget you. God help us to stay on our lands. We are restless now, so now they are squeezing us. If someone who is a little involved anywhere, he is recorded for Siberia. End citation. And early as July 1947, in the monthly reports of Soviet Ukraine MGB on the result of the work of the postal censorship checkpoints, the Chekists recorded in correspondence the reaction of population to the preparatory measure for the future eviction of Ukrainians underground family. Thus, in July 1996, such messages were selected for thematic information in August 62 and in September 158. Beginning in September 1947, monthly reports also provide excerpts from correspondence mentioning preparation for the evictions of family of repressed UN members. Such extract indicates the addressee, the date of the letters, and one moment. Okay, and you now can see how looks this exception in the full scale. They mention addressee who wrote these letters, and they mention also date, and then short illustrate what translated into Russian, and also the action of employees of Department V regarding the letter itself, and you can see at the bottom of these exceptions the letter K, it's mean confiscated. In this citation, you can read also about the people on the ground know about future deportation. Citations in English start citation. This morning, the MGB came to our village, convened those who have a convict in the family, and described the composition of the family. They asked how old the children, the elderly, whether they are with cows, horses, how many land, whether they had handed over the farm. Something terrible is happened. Ivan Tizarsky said that these families would be deported to Siberia. Such recordings are made in all villages. The time has come for us to have to disappear. There is no other way out. End citation. Similar reports were received from other areas. In another letter, a resident of the village Budy, Petro Kyrilovets from the same district of Rivne Oblast, wrote on June 13 to Kuzma Shevchuk in the Yaroslavl Oblast settlement Pereboy. It's also very interesting that very often the addressee of these letters placed inside Russia, deeply inside Russia, in Siberia or in Kazakhstan. So, what to write the Petro? Start citation. We don't have interesting news. As I wrote to you in the first letters, that many families are being prepared for eviction. We live like a soul without a body. You know, we hang like a queue on a pier. That's our life. End citation. Typically, the heads of regional MGB departments indicate at the end of each report that they repeated to their units the need for strictly keeping secrecy and preventive measure in the preparation for the deportation operation. At the same time, the measure of the postal censorship recorded the facts of non-compliance with the conspiracy by employees of the MGB who was sent from Moscow to Western Ukraine. In the memorandum of September 15, and except from the letter sent by one of the Chekists on the way from Lviv to Ala Berezhnat to Leningrad, Drovyanoi Lane. Start citation. Hello, Alochka. My present day is a collection of things and necessary accessories for departure for a special order from the city of Lviv to the district of Lviv Oblast for an operational government task. I receive the development of person and the eviction of their families from this region. To perform these works armed to the teeth and instructed to the law's conscientiousness. What caused my trip, since I work and was associated with work on paper, and now from the Ministry of State Security of the Soviet Union received an order for several people like me who were equipped for the above. But it not only from our partisans, but from other departments come, receive task and go to the specified place. End citation. It's like letters what written by the one of the MGB employees on their way to the starting deportation from Moscow to Lviv region. But it's not all, but what's very interesting that captured own trophy letters also testify that that Ukrainian insurgents knew about the plans of the Soviet leadership almost immediately after the appearance. On May 21, 2 letters from the Stanislav district of the were captured in a bunker in hiding place near the villages of Zabugayi. Today it's Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast. In both messages reported that in May-June, families of 3 categories will be evicted, both killed and alive rebels, next political prisoners, and said kulaks, or wealthy peasantry. In both letters, Zenko, it's like some insurgents with a crony who called Zenko, asked to pass the information and, if possible, to spread this information to his territory. The information contained in the excerpts from the letters allows further research of the personal survival strategy used by those who were the target group for further deportation. The situation was especially critical for single mothers with children. For them, saving children from deportation to Siberia was possibly sought divorced. The women hoped that in this way it would be possible to save their children. Third citation. Here, all those who have prisoners rewrite cattle, fields, peoples, and household. Every woman is trying to save herself as best as she can. Many file for divorce. Ksenia Slavinska was gone through divorce. Our Christina has also requested it, and so did the others. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry for Volodya, who will starve to death. Those who left for the Urals in 1944 have all died. I'm also thinking of filing for divorce. Someone will come to you that you would sign, and please sign. Don't think that I am filing for divorce in order to get married. But there is a black cloud above us, and I am forced to because I want to live. You are alone, and I am with a child, and I do not want to watch his starvation. End citation. It is difficult to determine whether this case were a mass or individual. Statistics of the number of deported women and children show that there were rather single cases. Village residents directly linked collectivization and deportation, and it's extremely visible from the postal censorship documents. The materials of the postal censorship checkpoints clearly state that joining the collective farms was perceived as a salvation from eviction, because collective farmers are not evicted. It's not true, but people thinking that it will be helpful for them. Nevertheless, in the vast majority of letters, the addressees write that they will not enroll in the collective farms even under the threats of taking their family to Siberia. In the special messages on the called on the negative reactions of the rural population to the organization of collective farms in the region, the issue of deportation is solely related to in the correspondence. Start citation from the documents on slide. Say, you need to enroll in the collective farms, but people don't want to. They say we will go east, but we will not go to the collective farms. Of course, in addition to those who were categorically opposite to joining the collective farms, there were those who were ready to enroll in it to save themselves from deportation to so-called remote areas of Soviet Union. And another citation also of Min, start citation. They say either go to collective farms or to Siberia. I will go to collective farms just to stay. End citation. After the deportation, all the reports of Soviet secret services noted that the numbers of villages who entered collective farms and the number of newly created collective farms increased significantly. So, for the local population, come to the and enroll to the collective, so-called kolkhoz or the collective farms, it was like one way of preserving their on the ground. For many eyewitnesses, the deportation was combined with a snowstorm. For one of the authors of the censored letters, stormy weather became a kind of harbinger of the deportation. Start citation. We have had snow for a week today and isn't melted. The trees were still completely with leaves. They were all broken. All the gardens were also broken. And now, as everything is visible from the Holy God, people will die, and it was revealed on the second day. How many people went from all the villages to those regions where you are? Since Kachalbeha went with her house to children's, I cannot describe to you. I will ask God to die in my house. End citation. Censored letters from the Chernivtsi region are especially rich in comparison between the natural storm and the artificial storms. Both troubles that came to the villages are described in many letters side by side, which creates the impression of the perception of deportation as an unstoppable, terrible elements that cannot be resisted. In the Chernivtsi region, the weather situation really was terrible. The regional operation had even asked permission to postpone the deportation later. However, in response, they received instructions to begin deportation under any condition. Disregarding the instructions from above, the district commander of the operation in the Storozhenetsky district decided not to start the deportation. It's only one known area where the operation was not carried out. Of course, this was not mentioned in the report of the result of the deportation that was submitted to Kaganovich and Khrushchev. From other sides, people who must be deported from Storozhenetsky rayon, and from point of view that the regional secret services units need move according to plan, they take another families from another regions because they have a long list, so-called like reservation list, and they take another people not from Storozhenetsky district but from another districts. In reports and special messages, Chekist provides the most typical in their option examples of the reaction of the population from Western Ukraine to the deportation Zapad. In some letters, the addressee tried to use Aesopian language or allegory. For example, the word "wedding" was used to denote evictions. Start citation. Dear son-in-law, 21 October, in our villages there was a big but sad wedding. Also in other villages there were weddings. Marenka and Kaska with the child went far where you are. In general, it is difficult to describe that this terrible night was. End citation. What was very interesting that the use of verbal codes was one of the methods of UN conspiracy, the needs for which was mentioned in the manual called Conspiracy, probably after Vasil Kuk. And this methodological material was also present in the collection of education materials for the education of own youth. The table of meaning prepared by the Chekist, among other things, indicates that under the word "wedding," the Ukrainian underground encrypt actions. So, therefore, it's most likely the author of letter and the recipient could have a connection with organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the liberation movement. What type of connection we don't know, but it looks like that they knew about methodology of conspiracy. Since November 1947, there is no longer a separate thematic sections on deportation in the monthly reports about postal censorship results. Information on deportations, because from the summer 1947, in every monthly report they prepared special chapter regarding the deportation issue. But from November they put this information about deportation to other parts. For example, to anti-Soviet quotation and so-called nationalist characters. And also we can saw what people wrote to their neighbors who stay in the Far East, in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Start citation. Don't be sad, be strong, in spirit as you once were. You have to be sure of victory. We will soon get right on this yoke. Your mother was taken away, but don't be sad. Something will happen, because this bullying will soon come to an end. We will be released once and for all. Slavka. End citation. As a rule, these messages are supportive and encourages, according to the authors, regardless of mass repressions and deportations, the victory will still be for Ukraine. Sometimes such letters also contains the belief that everyone would be able to return from exile after our victory. Also, very huge topics what we can read in letters. It's mentioned different way and different things around escapes from deportation. Particularly, but it's not only important for the local population, for the peoples, their neighbors was deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan, but also for Soviet secret services. Particularly important for the operative work of the Soviet special services. It's where reports on evasion of eviction, transition or illegal status, escape and return to deported families from place of exile. Escape from place of exile began immediately after the deportees arrived in Siberia and Kazakhstan. And early of November 1947, Soviet secret services began to detain fugitives. Postal censorship played an extremely important role here. So already in December of the same year, MGB was especially emphasized the need to read all letters in Western Ukraine very carefully. Censorship of letters helped to identify those who so far managed to avoid repression or to escape from Siberia and to establish their possible place of stay. Start citation. Many of those who were taken to Kemerovo region on October 22 have already returned. Marina Fedorchuk, daughter-in-law, also came. She ran away. The road cost her 800 rubles. She sold everything and came almost naked with 3 children. End citation. The number of escapers code was so significantly that in the spring of 1948, 2 echelons were needed to deport them again. So people who managed to escape from Siberia to Kazakhstan, they were catched at the beginning of spring of 1948 by 2 echelons, also removing come back to the Siberia and Kazakhstan. As a result of intelligence action of Ternopil department of MGB, it was established that the so-called special settlers, because all people who was deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan, in Soviet documents they called spецпоселенцы, special settlers. And that those special settlers, one of those special settlers, were writing letters to their relatives and acquaintances asking them to provide their own members with information about who had carried out their evictions and to take revenge on them. After partial review of incoming correspondence from the place of deportation by local postal censorship checkpoints from March 4 to 7, 56 anti-Soviet messages were found. It's citation from one of them. Start citation. I am very surprised that such people still live among us. Who profit from someone else good? Oh God, why did you take our best sons and leave them unworthily to be called Ukrainians? But it will all end soon. They will be fed by the damp ass. And as long as our Ukraine will not be good, as long as there are people who encourage on the good and of their brothers, for which he worked so hard, shedding that good with blood and sweat, we will soon shake hands with each other in a friendly way, and it will sound from our lips, glory to Ukraine. End citation. So-called Ministry of State Security of Soviet Union reported on the situation and provided examples of those messages. The structure addressed the special reports on the head of Department V to the Moscow and asked that the Chekists in place of deportation of sending correspondence, especially in the Kemerovo region, should be more responsible viewing letters sent to Western Ukraine. The next topic that the Soviet secret services focused on during 1948 was detection of persons who sympathized with the deported families to repress them. Very often they were praised. In the quarter reports on the last months of 1948, the MGB employees reported to Moscow that in May 1948 in Drohobych, 8 letters were discovered and seized from the villages of the Pitbuski, Drohobitsky and Khodoriv districts. Local residents wrote in letters that priests appealed to provide comprehensive assistance to convicted Ukrainian insurgents and exiled families in their sermons. Maria Homan from the villages of Novy Kropivnik, in one of the letters to her sister in the city of Korkino, it's a Chelyabinsk region, wrote, start citation, Dear sister, on the most important day of Easter, the priest in our village read a sermon about those who were convicted and deported to Siberia, about those who are in prison. He said that our nation is in great trouble. Listening to the priest and feeling the grief of the poor people, everyone who was in the church cried. The priest said, the Lord will save us from this cursed grief. People will stop carrying a heavy cross, and a joyful day will come for the whole nation. End citation. MKB employees established that the priest was Father Volodymyr Matushchak. He was arrested on July 15 on charge of repeated anti-Soviet agitation. As a result of the interrogation, MKB collected seven different versions of the priest's sermons and recorded them. All versions of the sermons were recorded in criminal case. It's the name of the files where employees of Soviet secret services put it all documents against one person or group of person who was moving to the judgment. And Father Volodymyr Matushchak addressed the community with the following words. Start citation from the sermon of this Father Volodymyr. Believers, we pray and ask God for those people who were innocently sent to hard labor in Siberia and are in prison. These people are now experiencing great hardship. Namely, they are suffering in the cold, hunger. They are dying of starvation. We believers will ask God for these people to return to their native lands as soon as possible. We will pray and maybe sometimes will change in the political structure in our native lands. We have to help these people. End citation. For these Easter appeals, the priest received 25 years of labor camps. Father Volodymyr did not return home from Siberia. On September 19, 1954, he died in the camp. In the same years after Stalin's death, change began to occur in the situation of previously deported families. Unfortunately, not all deported families can return to Ukraine, but they can return, for example, for Donetsk region, for South Ukraine, but not for the Western Ukraine, of course. As MKB employees noted in the report, this was an example of the successful operation use of the censored letters. As a result of Operation Zapad, the population of the western regions had the impressions that the Soviet regime had planned to continue evicting and deporting from 30 to 50% of the local population. Start citation. Dear Nastya, on October 29, all the families of Jews of those arrested and convicted were taken away. But that it's not all. They will now evict those who were in Germany. A total of 26,000 people were deported from our region, and 50% of the total population will be evicted, and the rest must be registered in the collective farms. End citation. From May 1947, censored letters began to mention that the Soviet planned to carry out another mass evictions. Employees of the secret services noted that there were rumors. However, there is not the rumors. They are not fictions. On February 6, 1948, the chief of Soviet Ukraine MKB, Sergei Savchenko, sent a request to the MKB of Soviet Union, which a request to authorize the continued eviction of own families as an action in response for insurgent activity. The corresponding order of the MKB of Soviet Union, number 00386, was issued on October 20. 1984. Therefore, the dynamics of the increase in the numbers of reports of planned evictions fully corresponded to the reality of the Chekist plans and actions. The new order provided for resumption of forced evictions, this time not as one-time mass deportation operation, but a permanent activity of the Soviet secret services in response to any actions by the Ukrainian insurgents. It was necessary to deport all their relatives from the near settlements. If the relatives were unknown, it was necessary to deport those suspected of supporting the insurgent movements. Monthly reports of postal censorship units, what was called Odel V, as I mentioned, also provide an opportunity to estimate the numbers of letters that have been confiscated. On this slide, you can see statistics from November 1947 to June 1948. They mention the topics when the letters was confiscated. At the top rows, you can see the numbers of all confiscated letters, and then the numbers of the letters that was confiscated according to different topics. And if you, for example, mention the information on November 1947. It's regarding the topic eviction and arrest of UN and UPA families. It was confiscated more than 33,000 of letters. It's like more than half of all confiscated letters. In this slide, you also can see the number of confiscated letters from July 1948 to January 1949. These tables show the whole number of all confiscated letters. An analysis of the postal censorship materials from the end of the spring of 1947 to the beginning of the 1949 shows that the preparation of Operation Zapad did not go unnoticed by the inhabitants of Western Ukraine. From the end of June 1947, information about future forced eviction began to circulate in the correspondence. Direct information resonance lasted until March 1984, and indirectly until the beginning of a new stage of the deportation campaign, so-called UN families, in October 1948. Despite the fact that the deportation Zapad was aimed at spreading an atmosphere of fear, the Soviet secret services tried to prevent the dissemination of this information. They monitored the spread of letters about the preparation, conduct, and assessment of the consequence of mass deportation in society moods. Letters with that information were confiscated. In particular, the MGB of Soviet Ukraine confiscated at least 39 and 605 letters mentioning deportation, which never reached the addressees. The postal censorship materials reflect the significant and long-lasting information resonance of Operation Zapad. The local population mainly negatively evaluates this repressive measure. For historians and social science researchers, quotation and excerpts from the postal censorship show the significant information potential of this group of archival documents for further research, which can help increase our understanding of Soviet past. So it's my presentation focused on my study of the deportation Zapad, and when I try to understand how the peoples who was deported, how their relatives, what they think, what their vision, what happens. And of course we have a lot of different so-called agents informations. We have these reports what was prepared by the Soviet secret service employees. But these exceptions help us really understand what people think about mass deportation, how they feeling, because they didn't believe that the Soviet Union read all letters what was sent from Western or to Western Ukraine. Thanks.